jump right into it. Today we'll be talking about React's useState. So as you can see here in line 7, useState is a hook that lets you add a React state, or basically a state, to functional components. And we'll learn about other types of hooks later, but just know that useState allows you to add a state to a React component. So on the right hand side here I have 3 examples. The first example is an increment example, where when I click increment, you can see the value go up from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3. This is the state, and we're incrementing the state on every click. In the list component, every time I add, then we get a row, and another row, and another row. So what we're doing here is we're updating the state, and the state is actually an array, and every time we click add, we're adding an element to the array. Finally, the object example, this is similar to filling out a form, but for the first input box, we could say first name, and you can see that being rendered out here. And on the second input box, we can say last name, and you can see that being rendered out here. So these are 3 examples that we'll be going through today. So let's go into the first example, which is the increment example. In the increment example, this is a React component starting from line 3. You can see that I've called it increment example. On line 5, this is where I define the state. I use React.useState, and here I've initialized the initial state when this component renders as 0. And what React.useState returns is actually an array, but I've destructured it here on the left-hand side, extracting the value and the set value. So these are variables that you can name yourself, but I've just called it value and set value. So this first element, this gives you the initial state. So this would be 0 at the very beginning. Set value allows you to update that state. In line 7, this is a function where you can see that when you call it, I'm setting the value to what the current value is plus 1. And that's why every time I click the increment button on the right hand side, we're adding 1 to it. This function increment is passed to line 15 button's onClick handler. So you can see how onClick takes in this increment function. So every time I click it, we increment. Now if I changed it to say plus 5, and we can try to call it again, you can see 7 jumped to 12. Now we're incrementing it by 5. So let me go ahead and reset this. And what you'll see is that it's back to 0. Now one thing I want to point out is what happens in line 9 if I uncomment this again. Now we have 2 set values where we're adding 1 each time. What would you expect? So let's go ahead and try. You can see that we're still incrementing by 1. So it doesn't look like we're doing this thing twice. And that's because this value is only updated after the render. So let's go through in line 8. What happens is it's 0 plus 1. So it would be 1, right? But we're still in the same snapshot. So when we get to line 9, value is still 0, and we're still doing 0 plus 1. And what we get is this final update. So in order to fix this problem, what we have to do is pass in a function into set value. So let's go ahead and remove that. So what you need to do is have the set value. Let me refresh this. So what you need to do is have the set value take in a function. And what this function does is it takes the previous value and we add 1 to it. And this way we can guarantee that the state updates and the second set value fires using the previous value as reference point, and we pass that into the function again. So look, increment is now incrementing by 2. So this is the example of how we increment a value using the useState function. Now the next component that we're going to look at is the list component. The list component, every time I click add, an element is being added to it. Let's take a look at that. Again, line 4, we have our React.useState, and we're initializing it with an empty array. And what I've called the value is array, and I've called the setter set array. In line 6, I have my update list function, and you can see that's being called in line 13 every time I click the button add. So what happens when I click add? Well, what we're doing here is just like what we talked about in the previous example. In the set array function, I've passed in another function which would receive the previous value, and I spread that into the array, and I'm just appending another to the end of the array. So every time we're doing this, our list is going to look like this. It's going to start out empty, then we spread the empty one and we add another to it. So the first instance will look like this. The second time we're going to be spreading the previous value, which is actually just this, into a new array and adding another. And we keep doing that every time we click our add button. So this is the JavaScript spread operator. Now finally, let's take a look at the last example, the object example. Again, line 4, we have our React.useState, and the initial value is going to be an empty object. And you can see that I've just called it state, and the setter is going to be setState, right? Now, it's going to be similar as the array example that we had seen just now, where every time we set state, we're passing in a function where the previous value is going to be used as the argument. And we're spreading that previous object into a new object right here. So you can see ... prev, that's to spread the previous values of the object. And then we're actually taking in the value name. So we're defining a key here, and that key is derived from the event object, the event value. So event.target.name is going to be just called name as a variable, and that key is what I call it. So look at line 15. In line 15, I call this first name and I call this last name. So what it would look like in the console is if I just console logged our state here, you can see that we'll be generating the keys first name and last name in our state object. So if I type Bob, type Lee, Bob Smith, and we look at that console, look at that. We have our first name and our last name. And if I decided to add a new key here, just call it new key, and let's scroll down, and let's see, test. You can see that we have new key as a key with a value test. So what this does is on change, it actually receives an event argument. And the event argument has properties such as target.name and target.value, which is passed into the state. And every time there's a change, we're setting the state. And that becomes the state of this component. So I hope you have a strong grasp on React.useState. Just remember that when we're dealing with arrays or objects, we always need to spread the previous value in and not mutate it directly. And when I say mutate it directly, I mean instead of doing the spread, we would just... Thank you, and that would be all.